have turned on the fairness level more towards predictable limits. Because some judges don't really see this as being as compelling as predictable limits debates are. However, I think that might just be because people aren't doing the ground debate correctly. So I think that this is something you should really think through as you evaluate the interpretations you're reading on this topic to figure out how to make your block extensions of these follow kind of this framing rather than just being like, you eliminate our ability to read disads. Because how many times have you heard to an R's where that is literally the only explanation of why ground matters, right?
So rather than like generics being gone, we want to go for like a generic skew argument almost?
Well, it's more so everyone knows what you're trying to get to. Everyone knows the argument is you eliminate core generics, right? But the question is telling the judge why they should care that core generics are being eliminated. Almost provide this debate uniqueness, right? Because eliminating core generics is the link to this disadvantage, right? The impact being you kill fairness. The question is, disads need uniqueness, right? Or else it doesn't matter. Right. So you need to give the frame for that debate, right? So this gives that frame. It explains why the judge should actually give a crap about ground loss in a debate. Because most of the time, judges are going to assume that this might matter a little more on predictable limits. And that just might be because it's a trickle-down effect from the college circuit, where more people are making this argument and using that in the 2 and R than this argument. So does that kind of make sense? Now, we're going to flip back over here, though, to predictable limits. Why do limited topics matter? They do kill preparation. How do they kill preparation?
It's a lot harder to prep 100 AFs rather than 10.
Who cares?
So,
debate's hard.
The reason that's bad is because it's really hard. Because isn't it?
We've got 3 people. You all can crowdsource.
Depth over breadth.
Depth over breadth. We got one
we need like a
phrase.
stasis point to be able to.
Okay, so we've got some phrases that are being thrown out. Now, the way that I've heard a lot of people extend this in debates is the phrase, debates are won by inches, not miles. And that is most definitely true, right? We have all of these files that we prepare. People access shared resources, etc. You spend hours at your high schools prepping for debates, and then you lose because one of the cards on your politics disad just wasn't as updated as the other team's card, right? So debates have a lot involved, and each debate can require tons of out-of-round preparation, right? So the knowledge that you bring into the debate sometimes, or the skills that you have, doesn't necessarily equal a win. Preparation is important because that's what allows for the ability for you to reach that nth level in the debate, right? So the reason that we prefer topics that not only they have that stasis point, which is the resolution, they encourage depth over breadth, right? Is because then we know what's happening in the debate. We have the outline almost of, here is the resolution, here are all of the apps that we need to prepare, and all of that other stuff is neg ground, right? The reason that that kind of separation is good then is because you are able to kind of have the ability to set up each debate that you need. So if you need a phrase that I usually attach, it's just debates are won by inches, not miles. So any subtraction from that limit that the interpretation you give creates is a reason to prefer the negatives interpretation. Now here's another question though. Which argument here between fairness and education or how do you think, rather, this is the question I'm actually going to ask, how does fairness answer the affirmative's argument that your interpretation is included in our interpretation? We just say there are other things that should be included.
Wait, what?
The permutation type thing that Alec was saying, which is a common counter interpretation, is like your interpretation X plus Y equals our interpretation of Z. Right? Why does the fairness debate answer counter interpretation Z?
Because you're proving a violation of the perm. If you have that debate set up and you prove an impact on fairness or
There we
education or on fairness, it means that their interpretation isn't fair, which means you can't perm it because they're still they're mutually exclusive at that point.
Okay, so we got to pull this back a little bit, and this is where we're going to start explaining how to extend and talk about your arguments to answer their arguments. You have the right answer. It was just a lot of gobbledygook in there, right? So the real argument is their counter interpretation doesn't protect limits because smaller topics are better than larger topics, right? We have this standard of depth over breadth. Deeper education or deeper topics means that we're able to have a greater limit on the topic, right? And that's just in the abstract. But the other obvious argument that you would make is there's a reason your definitions or your link to this argument said that this was not predictable, right? X makes Y or whatever. I hate math, but you get what I'm saying. This combination is what creates unpredictability in debate. You already have an impact for why preparation is important, and adding more burdens to the negative is something that we should avoid. So if the affirmative doubles the research load for the negative, it links to all of this framing that you've done of why inches are important in debate. And then the next question is, how could you articulate that the counter-interpretation of X plus Y, that's our counter-interp, still links to the ground argument?
Wouldn't the perm still explode ground? Because it still like sets up the bigger topic.
Now, remember, the explosion argument is the limits argument. Ground is saying that there is a particular debate that core generics access that only the interpretation provides, right? The interpretation gives us the link to these generic positions. And that is X. Your generic positions are based on your interpretation of X.
Our ground still doesn't link to X.
Your ground doesn't link to Y, which is what they add, right?
Yeah.
So if you have this politics disad that we've been talking about, or even federalism, this is a really key thing. If your interpretation is centralization is a regulation, that obviously sets up the generic link to federalism, right? And their additional interpretation is regulations just have to change current rules, or some like wishy-washy standard of what a regulation is. This, you can explain, is set up to be so abstract that it gives the affirmative too much ability to just spike out of DA links, right? Whereas this interpretation sets it up to where you have to defend the core of the education debate rather than whatever that other abstract nonsense is. So, does this make sense here?
Yeah.
Fairness arguments answer when the counter interpretation is larger than the original interpretation. Because either the simple size of the counter interpretation explodes limits, or the ability of the affirmative to choose the periphery kind of affirmatives, the AFs that link to that real abstract concept that their definition gives, means that all of this core disadvantage ground that's at the heart of the topic gets avoided. And this is where I kind of want to explain that often fairness impacts normally have an education argument kind of attached to them inherently, right? Because what's the impact to killing fairness?
No education.
It's that, like, if debates aren't fair, why do people want to participate in unfair debates, right? If you know that the game is already rigged, you don't participate. And what is the impact to participation? That's where we get to it. People don't debate, right? What is the impact to ground?
People don't debate.
People don't debate, and debate is good, right? A lot of that comes down to, and this is why some people who are more like on the critical side of debate get really frustrated with topicality, because sometimes teams just assume that this is an impact, but a lot of times it's connected to this impact, right? Because that's what debate is about in the end, is like learning. Some people will say just debate is a game. If you kill the game, that's not fair. Don't kill the game. And that's also an impact that some judges will buy and some won't. I'd probably buy it because I love debate as a game, but others wouldn't. So that's kind of how you want to think that these arguments sometimes meld. And understanding how they meld is important. I'm using the word meld because of kinetics. I need a eraser. It's on the floor. Okay. All right. We're coming back. I'm sitting down. So we just talked about fairness and how that kind of has embedded answers to common AF arguments. Education, I'm just going to put it out there. You might have coaches that disagree. You might have judges that disagree. Education from like the we won't learn as much of the topic type link is usually not as persuasive as the fairness debate on topicality. In a kind of vacuum, because obviously the fairness arguments have education components. So if you're just like, the way you talk about debate kills education, what is the typical affirmative response?
We're part of the core topic.
Yeah, we're part of the topic, or even just our counter interpretation is educational, right? Like, how do you debate on those kind of sides? You add what Mary Beth kind of suggested earlier of a topic-specific education component, where there's a big debate to be had over why the words like increasing financial or funds to education is important and is a core concept that we have to evaluate. Why?
Well, we talked about this earlier, but like it depends. Well, it decides what the net ground is. Like, the others I can do.
When we talk about education, I don't want you to think about debate. I want you to think about why the education that the resolution gives is like good education, right?
It fosters like a general sense of like critical thinking when applied to like policy making.
Yeah, particularly to this topic, right? Let's think about the education topic. And that's the one thing you want to move away from when you evaluate how you're going to come into tea debates. Ask yourself, why is this resolution important? Move away from the generic, we get critical skills, all of those kind of thoughts, and move towards why is thinking about funding education and thinking about regulating state control over education good? Like, why do we want deep debates over these mechanisms? Well, let's think about it. Who is in control of the agency that determines education policies in the United States?
Betsy DeVos.
Okay, I'm going to put it out there. I am not a Betsy DeVos fan. Most people weren't. That was almost a bipartisan issue, was that people were against as, I guess, civic people, maybe not since she did get affirmed, but voters were anti-Betsy DeVos. Why was that the case?
No experience.
No experience, right?
Big charter schools and privatization advocate.
Yeah, and that's where, like we've talked about, it's not there anymore, but you remember it, when we were talking about what direction the resolution takes, right? There's a reason the topic committee decided that the resolution should move in the direction against what the status quo is taking, right? We want high school students who are going to have really smart intellectual discussions about education reform to be able, potentially, to learn enough that they can combat what's going on in the real world, the world that we're supposed to be learning about, but often we lose sight of. So that's kind of the things that topic-specific education is so important for. So if affirmatives remove themselves from the core controversy area that the topic generates, how are you going to be able to do those things? A lot of times, if you're in a big high school, having a position like being student body president has like a lot of abilities attached to it. I know that my student body president, when I was in high school, was able to have like sit-in conversations with the superintendent, and like that was only because they like researched and like formulated an idea that they wanted the entire school district to do. So then they were able to actually have a sit down with the superintendent to talk about that. What type of students in high school do you think have the greatest likelihood to reach that kind of seat at the table? Debaters, right? Especially if you tell them you're debating education reform the entire year, gives you a certain, I think, ability to argue that you should have access to those discussions that others might not have. The more I'm talking about it, the more that a lot of this might bleed over to some things that you want to say on framework debates. But you kind of see, in many ways, they're not that different, I don't think. And it's because most of the time, I think, impact debates are more prevalent on framework arguments, because that's where you know you have to win the debate. But let's think about it. Impact debates still matter for topicality, because who cares if you're not topical if it doesn't really have an impact attached to it, right? And that's the question, and why I was starting to think of interpretations like counterplans, because what happens if the counterplan solves the AF but doesn't have a net benefit?
Then it's not competitive.
Not competitive. In a world of a counterplan, how does presumption shift?
F.
AF, right? If the 2NR goes for a counterplan, the AF can be like, you err AF on presumption, because they have not proven the AF is a bad idea, because there's literally no competition, right? The same way, if the interpretation doesn't do anything better for debate than the counter interpretation does, you vote AF on presumption, because they do nothing better for debate. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Cool. All right, flip it over. And we're going to go back to the neg side of topicality, but first I kind of want to spend time on the AF side, because I think a lot of that discussion informs maybe the next level of T debates on the neg side. So, introduction. Have a strategy. So, too often, I think, I've seen debaters answer T by first praying to the gods and then just throwing things at the wall and hoping that something makes sense. Don't do that. This will not get you anywhere in T debates. You have to think about this topic, and this is the B, by the way. Think about this topic and the types of T arguments your affirmative links to. Because understanding the kind of position that your affirmative has in the resolution is important to figuring out your affirmative's best arguments to any T argument, right? So if your affirmative is something you know might skirt the bounds of the topic, why is the education it provides good for the topic, right? You can think about that without even knowing what the interpretation is. If your AF is like really important affirmative ground, why is that the case? Why does your AF have to be included in the topic? And this is yet again something else you can think about without knowing the particular violation that they are reading. But you should still know that. And that's the C. The first file I think that teams should cut and read are their T files. Why do you think that's the case?
You really have to think about like why your AF is important to the topic.
Sure. What else?
Because it's a procedural thing.
Sure.
I guess you can brainstorm T answers and like framework-ish answers.
Okay.
First.
I'm just going to give you the answer I was looking for. How do you know what's going to be debated if you don't know what's topical? Right? How do you know what case negs to cut if you don't know what AFs are the most likely AFs on the topic? And a lot of times, how do you even know what AF to cut until you know what the lit says is part of the topic, right? Because I know I can tell you a story, and this is a nightmare, by the way. It happened, but I felt like it was a nightmare when it was happening. Last year, for the college topic, our varsity debaters cut an AF over the summer. It was because we hadn't cut our T file first. I tried to get us to cut our T file first. We didn't. And then, at our boot camp in August, by the way, literally, we're about to go to a tournament in a month. I sit down and I'm just like talking with one of our coaches, Patrick Cleary, and we have a 5-hour conversation about topicality. And we're cutting the T file. And I'm just like, our AF this isn't topical at all. Like 100% not topical. And we're sitting there and he and I go back and forth. And at the end of the conversation, both of us agree that we spent the entire summer cutting an AF that's not topical. Kind of stinks, right? So I think you should cut your T file first. And also, a lot of the times, cutting T file cards, interpretation cards, will also give you solvency advocate cards. So then it funnels the rest of your research. After you cut that file, you now know what the lit says each of these words actually means. So what does that then inform for bullet point B?
You know the topic better.
You know what your AF links to, right, on the T question. If you know that these are all of the different ways you can interpret the word or phrase increase funding of education, then you know what type of 1 and C's teams will put together. You know how to formulate your T increase funding block because you know any argument they could potentially put out there. So I think that's why that's pretty important. All right. Segueing into the most important conversation on answering topicality is the wall should have no flaw. I have to have fun with this. So, here are the obvious answers, and you all knew them, so I'm not going to tell you what they are, but we're kind of going to go into the way that these definitions can be argued, or at least the way each of these levels can be argued that makes them a little more persuasive. Check my time. Oh, I've got 15 minutes. That's fun. All right. So, we meet debates. We've already articulated on the thing that is now erased that I keep forgetting I erased, that we meet arguments are attempts to explain how the affirmative fits within the original interpretation. If you think about it this way, we meet arguments are almost reasons that you argue perm do the counter plan is true, right? Most of the time, the argument for perm do the counter plan is that the counter plan is the AF. There is no distinction, so they are not mutually exclusive. It is the same argument, right? So if that's the case, I think that that's the easiest way to kind of conceptualize a we meet. Despite the fact that the plan might be worded in a way that doesn't seem to be the same as the interpretation, They functionally do the same thing. And that's kind of the distinction that you'll create here, is that we meet arguments are normally, I'll say, effects key, somehow, some way. You like go around it to get to the end conclusion that you're topical. But the arg is, there is functionally not a distinction. So for example, on the interpretation of, in order to substantially increase funding, you also have to increase regulations. The argument would be, while the plan text doesn't say that happens, it obviously would, because when new funding occurs, new regulations get put in place, right? Does that kind of make sense? So at that point, you're arguing the function of the AF leads to the same interpretation. You still do it. Now, on this We Meet debate, I want to talk about a concept that Alec brought up a while back of how you can compare definitions. There are two different definitions that types of definitions I want you to think about. The first type of definition is a definition that has the intent to define. Those definitions can be argued that they are much better because you find them maybe from law journals of precedents that have been decided to say how phrases should be interpreted, right? That's legal, codified in the books. Like, this is what determines predictable ground, right? Why do definitions that are like court case definitions, why do they access predictable limits?
Because it's what everyone abides by.
Exactly, right? So if a court case has been used to define a word, then all of the smart people who write solvency cards or write disadvantage arguments or articles, they don't think they're doing it that way, but that's what they're doing. They assume that definition, right? And that's how they write their cards or write their articles. So that would be an argument for why intent to define definitions are better for predictable limits. Now, why are intent to define definitions better for ground?
Because of what you just said about
exactly.
funneling
It's the same
literature.
argument, right? If the lit says that, there's no other way to articulate how that matters. Education. Why are intent to define definitions better for education?
They teach you more about actual policy.
Real world education about how that stuff works, right? Now, flip side. The other type of definition is a contextual definition. Contextual definitions are how a word fits within an article, and it kind of explains the way it was used. But the author didn't really intend to explain that word. It's just the definition that you determine from context clues. I will admit, most of our starter file is contextual definitions. Because a lot of times they kind of all agree that that's how they're used. Most affirmative We Meet cards or counter-interpretation cards are contextual definitions because they're usually a little broader. The reason that you want to argue that these are good is because it's still a real-world argument. If this is how the literature is using this word, then the precedent of the intent to define definition obviously is not having its purpose, right? People are still talking about it this way, which means you should be prepared to debate it being discussed that way. Does that make sense? So I talked about the We Meet. Counterinterpretation can use cards that are two different styles. The intent of the counterinterpretation is to broaden the horizon of the resolution to fit your stuff in. And the biggest thing we'll talk about now is how you prove that that broadening is good, right? There are offensive standards and defensive standards. Offensive standards are always a little bit more important because it sets up why you should prefer your interpretation, not why your interpretation ain't that bad. Because let's think about this. If the negative reads a counterplan and your only answer to the net benefit is a no link argument, who most likely wins the debate?
Neg.
The negative, right? There's a risk of the DA. So think through, you always have to have at least some offense. Or your defense has to be so overwhelming that it shifts the burden of presumption over to the AF because there's no distinction, right? So offensive standards that are most compelling. AF, ground. If we don't have this AF, you have eliminated core parts of the topic. If your AF really ain't topical, you need a card for that. So that's the one thing. The amount of cards you read on T is determined by how untopical your AF is. If your AF is really untopical, you need a card for each of these levels. Like, have a we meet card. Or if it's just a like wonky way to interpret the wording of the resolution that makes you topical, maybe you don't need one. Have a counter-interp card. Have a card that says your AF is super important. Most of the time, this is a substantial card. Like, even if it's not a substantial violation, most of the time the card will say, like, Common Core is the heart of the education debate, right? And if that's your AF, that's what you would read. Or school choice is the current litmus test for debates that are happening in Congress. Obviously, kind of assumes then it should be considered AF ground and gives you a topic-specific education argument, which is the second offensive standard you can generate. Now, other offensive standards that are really important are kind of on the flip side of not necessarily our interpretation is good, but their interpretation is bad. So that is the negative over limits the topic. Breadth over depth is good. All of these kind of flip side equations from what we discussed on predictable limits. Now, these are kind of, most of you know these arguments because they're the generic things that everyone knows you say when you answer T. Defensive standards, though, I think are very important to understand how they affect the original interpretation. Some important defensive standards to know. The biggest one is the phrase functional limits. Does anyone know what that means?
Like within debate, like limits that you set on the topic. And it's like really like.
Sure. So I'm going to build off of it. So we talked about how limits is a big negative argument on T. A functional limit argument means that even though your interpretation doesn't on face limit something, that other factors from either debate or the literature prove that there are limits to what you are able to do. So, can you read an AF that says we should eliminate funding from NASA and put it into education if you don't have a card that says that? You can, but if you don't have cards that say that's a good idea, you're going to lose to a counterplan every debate, right? So that is a functional strategic limit on the topic. Solvency advocates are necessary to give good debates for the affirmative. Now, there are going to be tiny AFs. What are the advantages?
Tiny.
Yeah. Advantage ground checks because tiny, unpredictable AFs are usually not very strategic because they're not going to have a good lit base that defends advantage areas. So these are all kind of functional limits on that side. Now, beyond that, when you add in things like other words in the resolution check your argument, right? This is another common argument affirmatives do. So even if your interpretation of the word funding or regulation isn't exactly what the negatives was, you still have to be a substantial increase in regulations, right? Which provides that same check. So the literature checks AFs and the resolution checks AFs are two good functional limits arguments. This is one thing that I really recommend you start to think through because your defensive answers should always attempt to place a really persuasive no-link argument to whatever impacts whatever they're proffering on the standards level. Obvious ones that you've heard through before, and this is why I didn't talk about them too much as in this discussion, was things like potential abuse is not a voter. Like, it's not about what we justify, it's about what we do in the debate. These are very played out answers that are good to make that don't require that much discussion. However, the one thing that I will say is, if their argument is a ground argument, and that's all they're extending, and you didn't spike out of any DAs, what type of argument is this starting to give? Why should you vote on T as a procedural if there's no impact, right? The impact should be seen in the debate. So that's kind of something to think through as you're talking about it in the rebuttals. All right, reasonability. I want you to write down this person's name because we don't have really any more time. Ross Smith is the former, now deceased director of Wake Forest. There is an amazing video of him discussing what the word reasonability and competing interpretations means for topicality. There is no way I could ever surpass how good that discussion is. So I would very much recommend that you watch that video as a supplement to this discussion. However, we are going to go to the last page. And you can talk to Matt more about this in lab. There are two core ways to extend in the 1AR and 2AR on topicality answers to T. The first one is a largely defensive strategy, and the second one is more offensive. So, defensive strategy is a combination of a few arguments. The first and the most important is a reasonability argument. Because in order for you to convince the judge that they can vote af on presumption almost, you have to convince them that 1% risk of a T violation argument or an impact to T isn't enough to vote negative. Or an A- interpretation of the topic shouldn't be rejected because the AF has an A+ interpretation of the topic. Does that kind of make sense? It's still passing. So a counter interpretation and a reasonability argument is the first kind of set. Because if you can prove your counter interpretation is a reasonable interpretation of the topic, then you're in a good position in the debate. And I normally add some sort of standard that you isolated, whatever you're the most ahead on. Because those two things alone, some judges will not be persuaded by, and most judges won't. Because they have to say, like, why is your competing counter-interpretation reasonable? It's reasonable because it's still educational, and it still provides ground for both sides. That sort of articulation. You can also couple the defensive strategy with a we meet argument. And you have almost the same interpretation. Our we meet might not be as stellar as they wanted it to be, but we functionally meet their interpretation, which proves our interpretation is pretty reasonable. Offensive strategy is when you really jettison the reasonability in way of calculating this debate, and you just say, our impacts outweigh their impacts. Here is the offense-defense calculation for it. Here's what we're going to talk about. Here's our competing interpretation. Our competing interpretation is better for ground. Here is defense to their impacts. This really requires getting much better at rebuttals on T. Because you really need to package your offense and then almost do a turns case debate, right? A turns the disad impact. You're extending your offense and then you're using it to access or consume whatever style that they're going for. That's a lot of that discussion here that I gave, and that's why I didn't talk about it as much. You've probably heard before. So I wanted to go through the top level to kind of chat through the standards debate because I think that's a little more important. The only thing that I have for 4 of arguments that are not a thing is reverse voters. Get good at tea, not cheap shots. Dismissed.